An outstanding spring break, and everybody is back here rested and ready to kick into overdrive here on the home stretch. One of the things that I want to talk to you guys about here today is going to be what the balance of this semester is going to be looking like. Forgive me here while I kind of adjust my technology. We just had a power kind of flicker here just a little bit ago. It didn't happen on my equipment, but it did happen here in the house. So I have what we call a UPS, an uninterrupted power source that I have on this equipment here, so that if we do have that happening, it doesn't affect what we're doing here, you know, Lord willing. So I hope that that is the thing. I think that we're there. Yes. Okay. Anyway, so as we talked about before spring break, is that now what we're going to do here in the month of April is that we are going to grind through the rest here of the chapter. You've got more than 3/4 of the material under your belt already, and now it's time here for the home stretch. If you look here, and you can see that in essence you have this is what we have remaining is on these chapters here. We're going to be talking about the introduction of instrument flight here today, because I want everyone to have a full understanding of exactly what it is that we're going to be covering here as we round out the balance of the month, and then everything from there is going to be test prep for the private pilot written knowledge exam and the instrument rating knowledge exam. So those are going to be the things that we're going to be doing. So when we go through this here today, what you're going to see is this is what we're going to talk about here. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 chapters that we are going to be knocking out here in April. And guys, I have to tell you this. You have to have read this material before we go through it in class. I know that I have preached that from day one, that this is called a flipped classroom setting. And by that, again, it's where you read the material and then we discuss it here. We will not have the time to finish everything and to go through everything, every syllable in class. It just won't happen. And the study pieces that go along with these, you have to do them. This is no different than anything else that we have done all year long, but I'm just reiterating the fact that this is what has to happen, okay? Because we will be knocking out these tests in Grand Junction in May, and then we'll finish up the rest of the course here throughout the year, because we want to make sure that we get everybody taken care of, and that then after we get those things done, then we'll do some neat stuff, some NTSB things that are kind of interesting, but not necessarily a part of what it is that we do here. So just kind of keep that in mind. So again, we're going to be going through this introduction here today, and then it is game on with how we're going to be knocking these things out. So just want to let everybody know. Okay, there it is. So now let's get out of that and let us proceed here. Come on. Oh man, I was afraid of that. There we go. Okay. Yeah. Oh look, white. Introduction to the instrument flight. So what exactly is instrument flight? Remember, the flying that we have talked about thus far has been, can I see outside the cockpit? Can I see outside in your VFR private pilot training, your most important instrument, which is your windscreen, looking outside, being able to do that. But we know that there's this thing called weather. And this thing called weather, we have these other little interesting phenomena here down low in our atmosphere called clouds. Clouds can be these white, fluffy, kind of low-hanging things that can sort of just be out there in the sky, things that can be relatively benign, or they can be relatively horrifying. And those are going to be the differences, is to say, once we start the instrument flight piece, those clouds are kind of in my way. Wouldn't it be great if I could fly through that cloud and proceed directly to wherever it is that I need to go? That's the whole purpose of instrument flight. In order to do that, you have to fly that airplane by sole reference to the instruments, meaning CSN, can't see nothing, right here on your instruments. This is where you live. And it is being able to look at that instrument panel and identify where am I? Where am I going? Am I right side up? And am I able to maneuver my airplane in the clouds with the vectors that I may get, or where it is that I need to go based on where it is that you're flying? So that's what we're after here in the instrument world, is being able to do that. So you would think that there would be this logical, systematic way for us to be able to do that, and by and large, there is. There are a few things there that you kind of scratch your head and you sort of go, whatever. But that's just kind of the way it goes here with all things governmental, evidently. So that's kind of this overview piece. When we look at this overview, we talked about this, I think, at the very beginning of the class, if I'm not mistaken. And so this is, in essence, what we're looking at here. So on an instrument flight plan, what we have is that we have, here's our airport, this is where we are, here's our destination, this is where we're going, A to B. As we look here at the departure airport, there are several things that we have to do. We have to do some planning. We have to be ready to go. We get our clearance to fly our instrument flight plan. We taxi to the runway. We take off on the runway. As we take off, we have our takeoff and what we call our departure. So we fly a departure. Now, whether that is going to be something that air traffic control gives us and they vector us out a particular way, or if they give us a standardized departure procedure that we ultimately fly between waypoints on our way as we gain altitude up to the en route segment, which is going to be this. And the en route segment, that's going to be by far the largest segment in a cross-country flight here. You may have, this whole entire segment right through here. That portion could be our en route segment, and it's going to be the longest. It can be completely in the clouds. It may be kind of partially cloudy. We may climb, we may descend, we may have a few vectors, we may have a flight plan that they give us, sort of what we have filed, and then they could come back and they could do this thing that we've talked about before, which is called GPS Direct. And I've shared this story with you, is that the very first time that I flew to New Orleans is that, and this was back in, oh my gosh, almost 6 years ago. And I spent an afternoon planning this flight, getting everything ready to go, doing all of my stuff, the stuff that we as pilots are supposed to do, getting everything ready. And I had a page and a half of a legal pad of all of my flight plan with everything. I get 25 minutes into my flight, and air traffic control comes to me and says 153 Delta Sierra, I can give you direct New Orleans. Stand by. You look at it, make sure that the weather looks good, make sure that everything else looks good. You come back 15 seconds later and you say, sure, I'll take that. And then you take all of this flight planning that you've spent hours and hours doing. You punch in KMSY direct to, there's your magenta line, you fly that, and here you go. So that's, that's kind of the way it sort of works. And that will happen more and more and more now, as we get more into the ADS-B stuff that we have talked about here. So that's your en route segment. Then from the en route segment, at some point, we got to come down, right? So let me change that. That looks a little kind of hard to see. So at some point, we got to come down. So this is what we would refer to then as the arrival segment, and this is where we begin to lose altitude and we come down. here in the arrival, where here we can begin to make our approach. So you have your arrival here, you have your approach here, and then you have your landing over here. So en route, departure. So those are going to be the segments that we're going to be talking about how we do it. Now, sometimes the materials come in that order, in that big picture frame. Sometimes they put material in a little bit over here, and then we're going to put a little bit over here, and then we're going to take some information over here, and it's not necessarily as logical as we might think it would be here with the way that the material is presented. But it'll all tie it in at the end, I can promise you. Okay, so there's that part. There was another thing I meant to mention to you guys at the very beginning here as well, is that if we stay on task and if we're able to keep up, we'll get to spend more and more time on the simulators in the class as well. So that, just keep that in mind there also. So this is sort of the overview of what it is that we're looking at here in April about us knocking out. And you're thinking, wow, just that? Just that kind of stuff in the month of April? Well, it doesn't seem too bad. Well, and it's not too bad. It really isn't. But guys, it is just, there is a ton of material. And the other thing that you're going to want to be able to do is this, is something that we call couch flying. How many of you have ever heard of visualization? I think we talked about that a long time ago. But in visualization, it's where you sit and you kind of close your eyes and you sort of think of a particular thing and you sort of mentally project yourself in, doing a certain thing. We do it a lot in sports. I know that I was very first introduced to the whole art of visualization back when I was in high school, and this was in the Stone Ages. And this had to do with high jumping, because I ran the quarter mile. This tells you how old I am. Ran the quarter mile, and I was a high jumper. And in high jumping, so much of it is mental. And it's that thing where the very first time that you have this bar and you can walk under this bar, and then all of a sudden you have this thought and you think, okay, wait a minute now. I'm supposed to jump over that? This thing that's over your head, and you think, well, that's just not going to happen. But then it's all mental, because you look at everything, you look at your approach, you look at all of this other stuff that you do with high jumping, and you realize that you can actually get your body high enough to kind of go over this. And it's like, I never did get my goal. My goal was 7 feet. I got 6'10". But that's a thing. And if you think about that, here's this kid at the time that was 6'2", and jumping something that was 6'10", that's getting up there. And it requires a mental piece of just that visualization, seeing it happen, believing that it can happen, not just wanting it to happen, but believing it can happen. Well, this visualization piece for instrument flight is huge as well. And it's being able to kind of close your eyes and kind of watch things happen. And so the things that we talk about, the progression of things that we're going to discuss, it's going to be important for you to kind of close your eyes and think, okay, here's my attitude indicator, here's what my wings are telling me here, here's my airspeed indicator, here's my altimeter, and being able to kind of visualize these things. So you'll have to ultimately memorize the G1000, especially the primary flight display, because that's going to be that area where we will be focused. So just keep that in mind there as we move along here as well. And moving on here, scroll. The eyes and instruments, well, evidently the eyes are some important element into all of this exercise, as you might imagine. And what you're looking at is that you can see that your world right here is on your instruments. Now you can see that this pilot's hand is not on the side stick here. This is a Cirrus, by the way, so this pilot is controlling this airplane with the autopilot. And I will tell you that the autopilot is a big part of single pilot instrument flight. When I say single pilot instrument flight, the autopilot is huge. I've told you guys this before, is that I would have to think long and hard about going into an airport in a challenging situation, knowing that it was going to be a challenging situation coming into that, doing it for the first time without a working autopilot. Your workload in the cockpit is so huge that autopilot helps you a ton. But also remember, the autopilot will not hesitate to kill you. Garbage in, garbage out. You have to know how to program in what you need and when you need it in order for that autopilot to be a useful tool. So there's that. These things here, these are the basics. The 3 fundamental skills in instrument flying. These are things that again, you might expect to see on a quiz near you. You have the instrument cross-check, instrument interpretation, and aircraft or airplane control. So what does this mean? What this means is that you're looking at your instruments and you're looking to see what is it that my instruments are telling me. And when you say, what are my instruments telling me, it's not just one instrument. You are looking at instruments and you're thinking, okay, does this information that I'm getting here jive with all of the other information that is being given to me at this given moment? And you think, okay, well, I'm looking at this instrument and this instrument will give me X, this instrument will give me Y, this instrument will give me Z, this instrument will give me blah, blah, blah. And that is true. But when you look at them all together, then you realize that these instruments can be primary for a certain thing and secondary for another to give you certain information. And here's an example. So if we look here at the primary flight display of your Garmin G1000, we know here that this is our attitude indicator. This whole thing is a big attitude indicator, right? So we know here that this white line is going to be, I'm going to turn this blinking off here. The white line is going to be our horizon line. And we can see that our wings are here, and the wings are level, and the nose of the airplane is right here. So right now we're in straight and level flight. Let's say, for instance, that I wanted to make a turn. Well, if I'm going to make a turn, what is it that you expect for you to start seeing differently? What do you think is going to move if I make a level turn? Well, you're going to see your bank angle change, right? Because we're going to have to bank the aircraft, correct? So we know that we're going to see our bank angle change. What else is going to change? Do you think our heading is going to change as we start this turn? Yep. Do you think our altitude is going to change? Hopefully not. If we're making a level turn, that's going to change. So our altitude should remain the same. Our vertical speed should remain the same if we are making a level turn. What about airspeed? Well, if we're making a turn, a level turn, and we have not adjusted our power setting, we may actually see our airspeed decrease slightly as we're maneuvering that airplane in the air, because remember, we're kind of turning that. Remember the forces of flight that create a turn. So you have aileron, elevator, and rudder all involved. You're creating a little more drag. You're slowing down slightly in that turn without an adjustment in the power. And so you'll expect to see your airspeed bleed off just a little bit, perhaps. So you're interpreting what these instruments are telling you, and you're saying, okay, if I'm going to make a left bank, what does that look like here on my screen? And if I'm turning left, I expect my numbers to get smaller. I'm turning here into this turn, and I expect my airspeed to decrease slightly. If I notice that my altitude is decreasing, then I'm going to need a little more back pressure or a little more power to hold my altitude. If, for whatever reason, I notice my altitude is increasing, I'll release a little bit of that back pressure, possibly reduce some power, but probably not. And so I'll be looking at those things to interpret what the instruments are telling me here by looking. So the first thing is looking and cross-check. The cross-check component would revolve looking here at my bank indicator to make sure I'm banking into the right direction, making sure that as I'm making this turn, I'm going the right way. Also here from your lubber line, from this to make sure I'm making a standard rate turn, because in the instrument world, we always want to make sure that we're making standard rate turns unless we have been directed otherwise. Standard rate turn means that we are turning the airplane approximately 3 degrees per second, and we need to be able to time those. Timed turns are also going to be an important skill that we will develop. So I'm looking here to make sure that I'm turning at the right rate, turning at the right altitude, turning at the right bank angle, and not bleeding off any airspeed where it's going to get me in trouble with regard to a stall. So you're looking at these instruments, you've cross-checked them by looking at them, you have interpreted what they're telling you to make sure that this is indeed what it is that you want to do, and then you are physically manipulating the aircraft to make the airplane do what you want it to do. And it reminds me of my favorite Cajun flight instructor who used to say, "Greg, the aeroplane do what a pilot make it do." So that is some good flight instruction right there. And I'm just saying. You have to be able to control the airplane. Remember that anytime we talk about the instrument world, we're talking about the 3 P's. We're talking about planning, procedure, and precision. So you will ultimately learn to be a better pilot through this system, because air traffic control expects you to be a better pilot here in the instrument world. So that's what it is. So those 3 things that we have talked about here, these are the fundamental skills. Cross-check or your scan, instrument interpretation, understanding what that scan is telling you, and then being able to physically manipulate that aircraft where it needs to go. Okay? So we'll go back here and we'll look. Remember what your scan is. What is the alpha and the omega? That is correct. Your attitude indicator. The attitude indicator is the alpha and the omega. So your scan would go attitude indicator, heading indicator, attitude indicator, airspeed indicator, attitude indicator, altimeter, attitude indicator, vertical speed, attitude indicator, and it'll go to your engine systems, which are on your primary your multifunction display, and you'll check check your instrument systems. So that's kind of what that looks like. It all begins and ends here with your attitude indicator. Now, cockpit and the radio. We talk about the nest. We've talked about this before. Is you have to make sure that you have everything right where you need it. The one thing you don't want to do, and we learned this in the physiology section at the very beginning of this course, is to try to move your head around a lot in that cockpit. Because if you're in instrument situation like this and you've got sensory overload happening, the more you physically are moving around in that cockpit, the more susceptible you may become to some form of motion sickness. And let me tell you something here, brothers and sisters. If there's one place where you really do not want motion sickness, it's in the clouds. So make sure that you have everything right where you need it, right where you know where to reach to get what you need. All right? Good communications. And we talk more about this here a little bit later as we kind of get to the end of things here with regard to communications. Because remember, you're not able to see and avoid in the instrument world. And so you have to count on air traffic control to separate you from other traffic. And they're counting on air traffic control to keep you away from them, just as you're counting on them to keep them away from you. And being able to comply with instructions is very important. So you have to be able to listen, and you have to be able to understand what is being asked of you. But you also have to take that situational awareness piece to that next step, which is situational understanding. Does this direction make sense to me? And I've told you this 100 times about the time that I was basically asked to turn left into the Sandia Mountains by air traffic control in Albuquerque. It was an honest mistake that was made by an air traffic controller, but it was one of those things that, thank God, I was paying attention and realized, okay, now wait a minute, I'm over the north end of Albuquerque, I'm heading south. If he turns me left on an easterly heading, I don't think that there's a good chance of me flying through that granite unable. So just keep that in mind as well, is that you cannot just submit and just blindly follow instructions without thinking them through. This is part of this thing that we're talking about that we just talked about here. The attitude, basic attitude instrument flying is understanding how your instrument panel works, also understanding that you have a full panel here and you may have a partial panel over here. What is a partial panel? A partial panel is that thing where not all of your instruments are working. When everything is looking like this and everything is working great, things are pretty straightforward, and I'm not going to tell you that they're easy, but I am going to tell you that it's easier than when you have stuff that's not working. So if you have stuff in your airplane that's not working, you got to know, first of all, that they're not working. And then you have to be able to eliminate those instruments from your scan. Now, it's game on, because now things get a little bit more challenging here as you start maneuvering through this instrument flight. The one nice thing about the Garmin G1000 that we use in our training aircraft is that if you have an instrument that begins to fail, it just fails. You wind up with those red X's on that instrument. It's not like it is with the old-timey stuff that we used to fly, where you had the analog gauges, and if for whatever reason your vacuum pump began to fail and you didn't notice it, and then you start thinking, you're looking at your gyroscopic instruments, yes, you still have to remember what those are, is that if you look at those gyroscopic instruments and then all of a sudden your attitude indicator starts showing you that you're in kind of a left bank, well, you want to fix that, right? So you're going to bank it to the right. Well, then it still goes to the left. You fix it to the right. It still goes to the left, and what you're doing is you're basically fixing yourself into a death spiral over here because you were not aware that your attitude indicator had failed. This is why you check your attitude indicator with other instruments that you have in your aircraft. So you've got to just keep that in mind, is that that's where the partial panel comes into play. Okay? And by the way, in the clouds, if you have an indication here like this and you lose part of your instruments, you're squawking 7700, you're declaring an emergency, and you're declaring vectors to the nearest VFR weather, and you are now a priority, because this is something that you do not want to mess with in the clouds. Unusual attitudes. I'm not necessarily talking about the unusual attitudes that sometimes we bring into the classroom with us every day. No, I'm talking about an unusual attitude that you have put your airplane into. You have flown your airplane into an unusual attitude. What is that? It's either a really, really steep bank, it's a steep descent or climb, something like that. And it's recognizing that you have flown into an unusual attitude. What's the best way to do that? It's making turns beyond standard rate turns. That's number one, is where you're attempting to do that. And so that's the number one culprit of being able to do that. So as we look here, recognizing unusual attitudes and how to correct from them. That is something that you practice when you fly. The procedural instrument flying, that's basically everything that we've talked about. It's following the books here. En route tracking here for your instruments, we've talked about that in the VORs ad nauseum. Using these funky little things here that you guys are going to be using in the very near future with regards to how do I make this approach and land this airplane when I can't see the airport, when I can't see what's going on the terrain. And so with this, we use these approach plates. So these are the approaches, and we will talk about those a lot here, actually. And this is a thing that every time that there's an illustration on this, my scrolling thingy just really slows down. The first page that you saw were the government or the NACO charts. The second thing that you see here are the Jeppesen approach plates. We're going to show both. Our focus is going to be on the government plates more so than the Jeppesen plates. Either one are great, but just the look of them is a little bit different. You can look at those and you can compare and you can see what the deal is, the plan view, the profile views, what the information that, you know, that they're giving you there. Scrolling. The ground trainer, understand what the differences are between the different types of simulators. The desktop simulators that we have there in the classroom that are sitting there around you, those are there for entertainment, basically, according to the FAA. You cannot use those desktop simulators to log actual flight time. And there's a little reason for that. It's kind of goofy, but it's not to suggest that those things are not useful, because they truly are useful, even if you are unable to log the flight hours by using those machines. They are extremely useful when it comes to practicing procedures, and it comes to pre-flying some of the cross-country flights that you guys are going to be flying. So they're pretty cool in that regard. The great big box in the corner of the classroom there, however, that is an advanced aviation training device. And with an instructor, you can log all of those hours in your logbook. Certain numbers of the hours can be applied towards certification, but all of the hours go in your logbook and all of those hours count. Okay? So you have to understand what those are. If you look back in the day, this is kind of what a state-of-the-art, what they call a PCAD or PCATed in this case, could look like. That's kind of what it looked like back in the day, to sort of represent kind of where we are now. And you can see that where we are now is way different from where we used to be. So that's the deal. Attitude instrument flying. This is that thing that you kind of have to understand. This power plus attitude equals performance. Power plus attitude equals performance. Think about what that means. Is that adding or subtracting power is going to affect the pitch of your aircraft, right? And then also adjusting the pitch of your aircraft is also going to have an effect on the power if you don't adjust it. So you kind of have to think about what that is. Remember that when you're, excuse me, when you're in the en route phase, you have everything all trimmed out, you have your power set, everything is ready to go. Yeah, I mean, everything is just working just perfectly. And here you are in straight and level flight. If you pitch the nose up, your airspeed is going to decrease if you don't adjust your power. If you lower your nose, your airspeed is going to increase if you don't adjust your power, right? Now, here you are again, straight and level flight. If you adjust your power and you add more power, what's going to happen to your airplane? It's going to want to climb, right? What happens if you're in straight and level flight? Everything is good and you reduce your power. It's going to want to descend. So you have to understand how both of those things can affect a certain thing. So just remember, it's like to reduce your performance, all you would have to do is reduce power and pull up your nose, and your airspeed is going to bleed off really, really quick. Conversely, if you lower that nose and add power, well, now you're a lawn dart. So you have to kind of think about what it is that we want to do. It's kind of counterintuitive to sort of think this way, but the way that you're taught is that you pitch the aircraft for an airspeed and you add power for altitude. And the way that you can kind of think about this is that if you're on an approach, on a short approach, everything is all nice and stable, you're on your glide slope, you're on your localizer, remember localizer left and right, glide slope, vertical. Everything is looking good. If you add power, you're going to increase your altitude. If you reduce that power, you're going to lose some of that altitude. Now, the actual way that that works is that sometimes you will actually adjust your pitch to hold that glide slope more so than you will the power, and you'll take that couple extra knots. It's just sort of the way it works. You cannot, in most cases, do it all with just power. Ultimately, you want to get to that place where you can, but just understand the practical nature of it is that you are kind of driving that airplane down that glide slope and holding that pitch and that localizer here with your controls versus your power. But that's kind of how you need to think about it, is that you pitch for an airspeed, power for altitude. Think about that for just a moment. That's long enough. Okay. Here we are here, and it shows you the different displays. This is the Garmin G1000 right here, and it shows you, it's pretty self-explanatory what it's showing you there. Check the attitude indicator every few seconds. Good counsel. When you are in the clouds, the attitude indicator, the alpha and the omega. Pitch attitude, there you go. Understand that the airplane flies identically in or out of the clouds. The physics still work there, but I will tell you this. If you're flying into a cloud and you think, oh, it looks so light and fluffy, that cloud forms for a reason. Remember why that cloud forms is because you have air moving in underneath that is pushing this cloud upwards in some cases, especially the cumulus type clouds. And so you have that air moving up there that cools the air to a certain dew point, and then when you reach the dew point is where you get the visible moisture. That's where you begin to see the bases of those clouds. So if that moving air like this is creating that cloud, is it going to be all nice and soft inside the cloud? No, it can be a little bumpy. And so you have to kind of to expect that when you're flying into a cloud, making sure that you have all of your loose objects secured, making sure you can reach everything, making sure that everything is the way that you want it before you get into that cloud, making sure you got your pitot heat on, making sure that depending upon the temperature, your prop heat's on or your de-ice system is on before you penetrate that cloud. And you do it in such a time that that stuff warms up before you get there. Okay. You can read that. Well, you should have already read that. Scanning the instruments. We talk about the scan of the instruments. Here's kind of how it looks. Holding patterns. This is what we talked about here before. Standard rate turns, how a standard rate turn works. All of this we've covered. Attitude indicator telling you how it all works in your engine pages. This is on the Avidyne system here. This is Avidyne. Cirrus used to use the Avidyne systems before they switched everything over to the Garmin G1000 systems. I'm not sure who's using Avidyne anymore. Not sure at all. Scanning the instruments in a glass cockpit. Talk about that. Controlling the airplane. Yep, there's all of that. And all of this stuff is stuff that we've talked about. Sensory illusions. This is going to be that thing that, again, you're subjected to G forces. And remember, these are things that we talk about in the visual side, that we teach you how to obey what the airplane is telling you based on the signals that it's sending to your butt and other things. And then in the instrument world, we teach you how to ignore it all and then just trust your eyes. You have to trust your eyes on this, not what your butt's telling you, but what your eyes are telling you here with regard to your instruments. That's how you save your bacon. All of this here, little timer just went off to tell me that we are done with this class here. How do I stop that thing? There we go. I'm going to go on here. Instrument rating test. This tells you all about that, and that is chapter 20. Okay? Now, with next chapter, we're going to get into chapter number 21, and this is where we start breaking down those segments, talking about how we get into that whole instrument piece here. But we're going to do it one bite at a time. Okay? All right, guys, there you go. Enjoy your day. Happy reading. Please, please, please stay up with the reading. Remember, you got to read it before you come to class. Got it? Okay, guys, have an awesome day. I'll see you.